So good morning, everybody. I'm Shari Jacobson. I'm an associate professor of anthropology here at Susquehanna University. And I'm joined today by my colleagues, Emma Fleck, an associate professor of entrepreneurship at the Sigmund Wise School of Business, also at Susquehanna University, and Miranda Carrasquillo, who is the coordinator of the Johnson Center for Civic Engagement at Susquehanna University. Thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement and ask you to join us in recognizing the legacy of the Susquehanna people who were the first stewards of this beautiful place and from whom this university and the river derive our names. Miranda, can you advance the slide, please? So today we take our inspiration for this panel from Martin Luther King Jr.'s Give Us the Ballot speech. I'll be talking about the work of Dr. King in social justice and voting in the United States. And Emma Fleck will be discussing the external influence of Dr. King, focusing on the case of Northern Ireland. And Miranda Carrasquillo will wrap up by discussing the work of our nonpartisan Achieve, Lead, Vote committee here at Susquehanna, which is dedicated to supporting student voting. And there will be time for some discussion and questions and answers at the end. Thanks. Next slide, please. Dr. King delivered his celebrated Give Us the Ballot speech at the Prayer Pilgrimage for Freedom on May 17th in 1957. The topic of the pilgrimage was the Brown v. Board of Education decision, which the Supreme Court had decided in 1954, but had been met with consistent and even violent resistance. For example, white citizens closed segregated schools rather than have them desegregated. White citizens established private Christian schools, sometimes referred to as segregation academies, again, as a way of subverting or avoiding the imperative to integrate schools. And white school boards fired the Black teachers and principals and other staff who had been running the Black segregated schools as a way of consolidating and guaranteeing white leadership in the schools moving forward. These were just some of the challenges that white citizens posed to the Brown v. Board of Education decision. And so the goal of the pilgrimage was really to prod the federal government to fulfill the promise of the decision. As Dr. King saw it, an immediate problem was white people's systematic exclusion of Black Americans from the democratic process. And here I quote from Dr. King in the speech. He said, "All types of conniving methods are being used to prevent Negroes from becoming registered voters." Here he was referencing a long history of voter suppression, things like poll taxes and literacy tests. Next slide, please. And so the goal was to this the solution to this unfulfilled promise of the Brown v. Board of Education decision was to, quote, "give us the ballot." Dr. King argued in the speech that ensuring that Black Americans had their right to vote fulfilled would obviate their need to constantly petition for the most basic rights and would in fact take the burden off the federal government because Black people could participate in deciding who would represent them. He argued that it would ensure devotion to justice and mercy in Congress and the courts, and that it would even address problems of lynching because people could vote for sheriffs and other elected officials who would hold people accountable and ensure public safety. He argued that it would, quote, "transform the misdeeds of bloodthirsty mobs into calculated good needs of orderly citizens." Next slide, please. But he knew what a long and challenging struggle this would be. And as you know, the Voting Rights Act didn't even come about until 8 long years later in 1965. The Voting Rights Act was a way of overcoming legal barriers to voting at state and local levels, barriers that white citizens had erected to keep Black citizens from voting. Sadly, much of this act was gutted by the Supreme Court in 2013. And the protections that had been afforded by the Voting Rights Act were diminished. As late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg put it, this was like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you are not getting wet. And we see current voter suppression throughout the country with the emergence of, increasing emergence of voter ID laws, exact match laws, poll closures, voter purging. Just to give you an example of this, in 2019, Georgia purged 300,000 quote unquote inactive voters from registration lists. And this was done so hastily and so sloppily that within days they had to reinstate 22,000 of them because they had been purged erroneously. And to put that in perspective, the margin by which President Biden defeated Donald Trump in Georgia in 2020 was 11,779 votes. So those 22,000 voters who had been erroneously purged could very well have been the voters who made the difference in that election. There are also restrictive laws throughout our country, laws that ban felons and ex-felons from voting, to the point where we now have an estimated 6 million citizens who were disenfranchised, and that number comes from 2016. There are false accusations of voter fraud that undermine the legitimacy of votes cast by BIPOC Americans. And by BIPOC, I mean Black, Indigenous, people of color. Just again, an example, the Conservative Heritage Foundation did a multi-year study of 5 states with vote by mail, states that have vote by mail provisions, and found only 97 instances of voter fraud over multiple years. This was out of nearly 50 million ballots cast. A fraud rate, a mathematically insignificant rate of 0.00002%. So nevertheless, accusations of voter fraud undermine the legitimacy of elections and the rights of all citizens above the age of 18 to vote. Next slide, please. But I'd like to end on a note of hope, taking some inspiration from our National Youth Poet Laureate, Amanda Gorman, and talk about organizations that are working for change and encourage everyone here today who cares about democracy and cares about voting to get involved. We heard on Tuesday night from Latasha Brown, who started Black Voters Matter. Stacey Abrams has an organization called Fair Fight. Both of these organizations are particularly dedicated to getting Black voters registered and ensuring that they have the right to cast their vote. Mi Gente is an organization that works with Latinx Americans to help guarantee their right, that they are able to exercise their right to vote. There are organizations that are particularly concerned with youth voters being disenfranchised and support the rights of young people to get registered and vote, the Andrew Goodman Foundation, for example, and the Campus Vote Project. And there are other national organizations, League of Women Voters, ACLU. If you have any questions about how to get involved in the voting rights movement or how to support our democracy, please feel free to reach out to me. I am Jacobson at susqu.edu. And now I will turn this over to Dr. Fleck, who will offer a powerful account of how the work of Dr. King influenced social justice movements in Ireland.
Thank you, Professor Jacobson. Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be with you. And we've just been given an outline of the influence of Dr. King in the voting process in the US, but I'd like to talk to you about his influence outside the US and in my part of the world, Northern Ireland, where I was born and raised and educated in this incredibly small part of the world. It has less than 1 million people. And in this little corner of the world, Dr. King had a huge impact on not only our people, but the history of our country. To understand why, I will give you a very abbreviated history. In 1921, Ireland gained independence from Britain and the UK, But in doing so, Ireland split, with Northern Ireland remaining as part of the UK. And this was a predominantly Protestant region. And one of the founders of this region said, "We will be a Protestant parliament for a Protestant people." And the state was unapologetically biased against Catholics. And because of this, there were many significant areas of inequality. In jobs, because Northern Ireland profited from its trade links with Britain, and most Protestants owned the large firms, they were controlled by Protestant unions who either refused to hire Catholics or indeed give preference to other Protestants. And discrimination happened at all levels, from the shipyards to the boardrooms. In housing, it was a huge problem post-war because there was a significant housing shortage. But when public housing became available, it went to Protestant families and not Catholic families. In education, education's system was segregated by religion, whereby the country's state schools were Protestant and indeed well-funded, while Catholic children attended schools funded and operated by the Catholic Church. And this meant that there were huge barriers to higher education, and that then Catholics were underrepresented in white-collar positions like the civil service, law, finance, in the judiciary system, and in the police as well. And finally, voting. The voting system, which was set up in Northern Ireland after this split, allowed the rich landowners and businessmen multiple votes in the system. So the system was completely flawed and non-representative of the Catholics who lived in Northern Ireland. But in the 1960s, television was prominent in many households, and the news from the United States showed a man who was speaking out about segregation. Although different in many ways, his words and his peaceful actions spoke to the oppressed Catholics of Northern Ireland, and several groups emerged to challenge the Protestant rule and demand an end to anti-Catholic discrimination, and indeed an equal right to vote. You can forward the slide, please, Miranda. So the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association was one of these organisations, and it hadn't really got any political goals except to demand one man, one vote, and the repeal of discriminatory legislation which prevented Catholics the equal right to vote. And this organisation undoubtedly drew their inspiration from the work of Dr. King, hoping to bring about the change in the way that he did through non-violent protests and marches in the city across the country. One of the most well-known marches was from Belfast to Derry, two cities in Northern Ireland, and this was known as the Civil Rights March, and indeed was a nod to the March on Washington, which was led by Dr. King. Unfortunately, these peaceful protests didn't last long, and as the extreme wings of both sides turned to violence, and the police and the British Army were sent in to oppress the people involved, which led to many years of what we now call the Troubles, and years of unrest and civil violence in Northern Ireland. And although segregation continued for many years, this movement caught the attention of the British government so much that by 1970, all people of Northern Ireland over the age of 18 had an equal vote. Advance the slide, please. And so from this civil rights movement came new political parties, and these were formed based directly on the teachings of Dr. King. And one of these was called the SDLP, the Social Democratic Labour Party. And the leader of this party was John Hume, pictured here on the right. And after many years of unrest and violence in Northern Ireland, he successfully negotiated the peace process in 1996. It was a huge thing for me as a young person. I was 18 years old, and all of my life I had only ever seen violence in my country. So this was huge. And indeed, he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Peace. And he was also recognized through the Martin Luther King Award, which was given to him by Dr. King's widow, Coretta, which you can see pictured here. And speaking in Atlanta, John Hume said, "We believed in the words of Dr. Martin Luther King. We believed in inclusivity, not exclusivity. We believed in true unity amongst all the Irish people, that it was a unity of the heart and not of the soil." And he went on to say, "The American civil rights movement gave birth to ours. The songs of your movement were ours too." Next slide, please, Amanda. And there are still signs of Dr. King's influence in Northern Ireland if you visit today. In Derry and in Belfast, King appears amongst many of the murals as a symbol of peaceful, non-violent protest for civil rights and equal votes. One mural, in fact, includes the closing part of King's famous speech, "I Have a Dream," which resonated strongly with the Catholics in Northern Ireland. And without Dr. King's example, there's no question that the Irish civil rights movement would never have started, and the people of Northern Ireland would have continued to struggle under segregation and oppression. And so in this small corner of the world, we will be forever grateful for the inspiration and example of Dr. King that he gave to my people and our leaders. And I just wanted to note that this morning I have become an American citizen in the last couple of weeks, and I applied for my voting registration. And this morning I got an email to say that I am now a legal voter, and I am delighted to be part of the American democracy process. So I'll pass on to my colleague, Miranda.
Congrats, Emma. What an awesome way to learn that. Congratulations. That's really exciting and so fitting for this presentation. So hello, my name's Miranda. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about what we're doing here in our community in Selinsgrove and at Susquehanna. And we'll wrap it up and then leave some time for you all to dialogue with us and ask some questions. So Achieve Lead Vote is our campus team made up of faculty, staff, and students alike. This Achieve Lead Vote kind of slogan was actually coined by one of our students who's now an alum. His name is Jameer Wilson, if anybody out there knows him or if he's here. It's obviously a play on our campus values. So Susquehanna's values are achieve, lead, and service. And this was kind of a way to focus those values and make it about voting. So the group started in 2019. We're a nonpartisan team, and where our goals are to really increase student voting engagement at SU. We talked about some of the barriers and voter suppression over the years that have limited people from voting, and we're really still working in a lot of ways to eliminate some of the residual barriers left over. So one of the things that Susquehanna students have historically, and college students all over the country have had as a barrier, for example, is addresses. Listing addresses for college students has been a historically confusing process, as many of them are super mobile and from one semester to the next are moving all around. So that makes it really difficult for them to register in one place and know where to go. At Susquehanna University, a lot of students who are tuning in may be familiar with this, but we actually have our campus split into 2 different polling locations, which has also been historically confusing and actually is not a problem unique to Susquehanna University. Many college and universities have their jurisdictions kind of split in weird ways that split the students into 2 different or maybe more different polling locations. So some of the work we do is to try to streamline that process if we can, and just educate students, prepare students, let them know where they're going. So another thing we do is we adequately prepare our campus community for pre, during, and post elections, and just some quick examples of each of these. So we were doing voter registration clinics. We were doing voting themed trivia with prizes. We were tabling, social distance tabling, and doing a lot of virtual discussions and Let's Talks leading up to the election period. During the election period, during election day, we had escorts, faculty and staff volunteers, escorting students to each of the polling places. We had a shuttle running from polling place to polling place, doing a loop all day. We had several emails go out that day, just reminding people to get out there and cast their vote if they hadn't voted early. And then post-election, we held several discussions, processing, debriefing, where do we go from here? After we gave people a little bit of time to receive the results and process the results, we held discussions so people could virtually come together and kind of debrief together. So thus far, I talked a little bit about, what we had put in place for the 2020 election. And like I said, this group came together in 2019, and we had a semester to get started, and then we were hit with COVID. So a lot of this stuff that I'm talking about, we had to figure a way to do remotely. But there were some civic holidays that nonprofit organizations developed ahead of the 2020 presidential election, like National Voter Registration Day, Vote Early Day, and Election Heroes Day. So we tried at Susquehanna to celebrate each of those days a little differently. We had some digital engagement, some social media posts, some students sending in their videos of how they were celebrating. which really helped boost and kind of spread the message of the importance of voting. And like I said, we held virtual discussions, we hosted some Let's Talk sessions, we tried to help students register to vote in several different ways, which is harder than the way we would have traditionally done that had we not had to be remote. And then we've got, as a result of this group, some new and exciting partnerships. For example, Susquehanna University is now a member of the All-In Campus Democracy Challenge. And so what this is just a friendly competition among colleges and universities across the country. And we publicly share our voting data, which I'll share on the next slide, and then kind of just, uplift and challenge each other to boost that data, to improve our rates of registration, our voter turnout rates, and keep moving ever upward towards, 100%. So here I just took a little snapshot. This is just a glimpse of some of the data that we receive from NSOLV, which is a report that is the National Study of Learning and Voting Engagement. So this data is a little bit old here. This is from 2018. And you can see, so our voting rate at Susquehanna was 29.5, which is up almost 10% from 2014, which is great. But then here you can see the national average. So while we improved significantly, we're also significantly below the national average. And this data, again, is according to 2018. And it's important to note that our 2020 report should be coming out in the coming months, and we're really excited to get a hold of that data and to share it. Like I said, these reports are posted publicly. If you are enrolled in the All-In Challenge, you can go to the All-In Challenge website, find a university, and view their reports. So here's just some quick snapshots of what we did virtually. Our wonderful marketing and communications department, I want to give them a shout out. They built us a webpage, a Susquehanna webpage, Achieve, Lead, Vote. Beautiful, colorful. We've got some gifts, and of course, Benny with the voted sticker. And so one thing I wanted to point out here, and I have, for those of you who are tech savvy, this QR code goes directly to our website. So if you're watching this presentation on your laptop and you have your phone by you, you can scan the QR code with your camera and it will take you to the website if you're interested. The one thing I wanted to point out was our voting resources tab in the bottom right corner. That is regularly updated. So as we find and come into resources, we send them to our marketing team. There's a web form and they get plugged on there. So as we find and identify resources that we think will help our students, they get added to this resource, which is really cool. And of course, our Achieve, Lead, Vote hashtag. Again, if you are on Instagram, if you're on social media, check the hashtag out, follow the hashtag. Our students have really populated that hashtag themselves. So how does this connect? How does this link to what we're talking about? This is not just a shameless plug, but we wanted to bring this into the presentation for a couple different reasons. So the 26th Amendment was passed in 1971, which makes this 2021 the 50-year anniversary of the passing of the 26th Amendment. And so 50 years ago, what the 26th Amendment was decreasing the voting age to 18 so that citizens, 18, 19, 20 could also cast their vote, and, more young people had the right to vote. And so there's this narrative about young people. You may have heard this, you may have perpetuated this. It's something we've all heard before, that young people in one way or another are apathetic, or they don't care enough, or they're not informed enough to be, casting a vote, or to feel, like they have a stake in the game per se. And so we've just seen time and time again them prove that couldn't be further from the truth, whether it was leading up to the passing of this amendment in 1971, or in 2020 turning out in record numbers to vote in this presidential election. So I just lifted a quote here from the Tufts University website, and this is actually where we get our NSOLV data, is Tufts University. So by our calculations, based on votes counted as of November 18th, 2020, suggests that 52 to 55% of voting eligible young people ages 18 to 29 cast a ballot in the 2020 election. That's remarkable, tremendous. Some of you here probably voted. Great job. And of course, using the same methodology, looking back a few years in 2016, it was 42 to 44%. So again, that's a significant increase over the last several years. So we really want to just commend our young people for getting out there, for voting, for exercising their right to vote. And I wanted to also bring up, for those of you who were in attendance on Tuesday night and witnessed Latasha's amazing convocation, something she said really resonated with me, and I felt like I could reference it here. She talked about how democracy requires us to participate. Like, it can't function without us. There is no democracy without us participating. And so, you know, we, with this group, with this team, and with the students who have volunteered and dedicated their time to help us with these efforts and these initiatives, are just proving that to be true, that we've got to participate, how important it is to participate, to cast your vote if you're eligible, and to uplift and equip and empower others to do the same. So quickly, I'd like to just, for our students and community members in the room, I just wanted to talk about the ways you could get involved. I included our emails here. You can email any of us if you're interested in getting involved. Students meet for ALV. So Achievely Vote, like I said, it's students, faculty, and staff alike. We meet together. We also have separate meetings for students. And last semester, like I said, this group is relatively new. Susquehanna University is a little bit behind. Some universities have had groups like this for several years. So we're catching up. But one thing I'm really proud of, and another thing I wanted to mention, each of our political student organizations were involved in this work. So our president of our SU Dems, our SU Republicans, our Libertarian Student Club were all represented in these meetings, which was really, really great. Of course, there's our social media and our hashtag. Students can volunteer when we have trivia events, when we have tabling. Of course, when we can come together physically again, we'll have a need for more volunteers, but there's always ways to volunteer. This semester, the Let's Talk schedule, if it hasn't been published yet, it will be soon. Achievely Vote has reserved a couple Let's Talk sessions where we'll be delving into some things like, what is unity? How does unity work in a democracy? And kind of picking up where we left off on this talk. So you can look at our Let's Talk calendar if you're interested in attending those. Of course, students, if you're out there, share our content, repost us on social media, tell your friends. And you can always make a Why I Vote video. So we post these on our Instagram. We post them on our website. Just a short clip, tell us why you vote. And we compile those, we keep those. And if you're comfortable being posted and, you know, getting Insta famous, we'll post it. And then lastly, we will come to your classes. It might not be me, Emma, or Shari per se, but we have students who we will train to come to your classes if you want us to do a little plug or a little blurb in your classes. So these are just a couple ways you can get involved if you feel so emboldened after this discussion. And now, of course, you can put your questions in the chat and we'd be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Well, maybe while we're waiting for some questions to file in, I could pose one to perhaps Miranda or Emma too. What do you think are the significant barriers to students voting that we see across the United States? Because that is a form of voter suppression as well.
Miranda, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think some of the ones that I've seen, like I mentioned, I can get a little bit more into it. The issue with addresses, especially this year, was one of a lot of chaos and grief for us here at the university. So not knowing what to list as your permanent address, or having a discrepancy between what you previously listed as your address and not being there, was a huge kind of barrier and challenge for people. And of course, having remote learners and people kind of spread out across the country just elevated that challenge to a new level. Um, I think the IDs can be an issue. Not so much for Pennsylvania. I believe, I might be mistaken, but I believe a student ID in Pennsylvania, it does qualify, does constitute as, sufficient identification, but that's not the case in every state. And so I think that's also a barrier, because not everybody obviously has a driver's license or a state ID. So those are the ones that come to mind. Emma, did you have anything to add?
No, nothing to add. Would you have a question if we want to start there?
Yeah, absolutely.
Cassidy asked, are there any other instances of movements being inspired by Dr. King's work? I know from a little bit of research that certainly the South African movement was inspired, but forgive me for Googling, Cassidy, but I did in 10 seconds. And from the Washington Post in 2011, there's a lovely article which talks about so many influences across the world. In Egypt in 2011, there was a civil rights movement which was inspired by, what else? 1980 in Poland, civil rights workers, even it says in China's Tiananmen Square, they sang "We Shall Overcome" as part of their civil rights movement. So I think that if you go looking, you will see that his inspiration and his movement was wide across the world. And I think one of the most interesting things I took from Latosha's talk on Tuesday, for those of you who did attend, was how before his death he was incredibly unpopular, and yet the work that he had done went on to inspire and will continue to inspire for generations. So there are many, many instances across the world. Anyone else want to add to that? There's another question from Olivia. Did the voting data include absentee ballots, or was it only voters registered on campus? Miranda, maybe could you answer that one?
Yes, I will try to answer Olivia's question and Katie's question kind of in one.
Perfect.
So I mean, if we've got time at the end, I can pull up that NSolve and share my screen and show y'all. It's several pages long. I do believe we include, oh, I lost the question. Where'd it go? Oh, here it is. So I do believe there's race and gender. I don't know if the data, and I'd have to go back and look. And like I said, if there's time, I'd be happy to share my screen and look through that with y'all. I don't know that they make distinctions between absentee versus, or mail-in ballot versus voting in person. I don't believe they do that. But I do think there's some demographics, some simple demographic information in there.
Miranda, maybe you can, is there a link that you can put in the chat that people can those data themselves?
Let me do that, yeah.
And then I see this question from Sadie. Do you believe that the significant voter turnout will continue through all the elections to come? That is a really important question. And these are all great questions. I do know, just from years of doing this work, we kind of had a rule of thumb that once somebody has voted, I think in 2 elections or something, they are likely to continue to be voters for the rest of their lives. So in terms of young people, turning out for this one and maybe, one more, then it becomes an established practice. I hope so. I see a lot of energy in a lot of different communities in our country that haven't really come out to vote before. Obviously, there's been a tremendous increase in the youth vote, but I would even say I live in a rural area near Susquehanna University, and my neighbors across the street, I've never, ever seen them put up any kind of political signage, and their lawns were covered with Trump signs this year. I don't know if they've ever voted before, but something about this election inspired them to vote. So, I mean, I hope it has generated more interest in our country. I've lived in places that are not democracies. I lived in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I lived in China. I lived in Argentina post-dictatorship, but you know, it had been through a dictatorship. And I think Americans need to recognize this precious gift we have of being able to participate and not squander it and not take it for granted. I don't know what others think about voting moving forward in our country.
Yeah, I would agree wholeheartedly, Shari, that when you have it, you maybe not as appreciative of it. And the right to participate is a right that someone has fought for in your life, whether it be as a woman, a person of color, you know, as I said, in Ireland's case, when you weren't a landowner or a business person. So somewhere in our history, someone fought for this opportunity for you to participate. So I think it's so important that you recognize that responsibility and use it. Get out there, do it. There's a great question here from an anonymous attendee. You could argue that the advent of mass media, especially television, was one of the catalysts for people like Gandhi and MLK to inspire people across the world. But mass media can also be the main tool to suppress through alternative facts. How can people combat these narratives and hear what needs to be heard? It's a wonderful question. Thank you for that. Anybody want to give that a go?
I'm sorry, I just got my link from the last two questions in the chat, so I'm not ready to answer that one yet.
Yeah. I think you know, in terms of this question about, you know, social media and what gets broadcast through social media, it is such a complicated issue. We do address this in a class I teach on regulation. You know, we're, as some, you know, as has been in the news lately, we're, you know, in the process of rethinking whether social media companies ought to be held responsible for the content that is posted through them. They have not been held accountable for that up until now, and that is being rethought. I personally don't have a settled opinion on it. I don't like the notion that a handful of extraordinarily powerful CEOs, Mark Zuckerberg, for example, are making decisions about what literally billions of people around the world are learning. Doesn't make sense to me that that kind of power would be vested in these individuals or tight little corporate boards. On the other hand, I think it's always tricky to regulate speech. So getting good content out there, I think, is critical. You know, here at a university, our job is certainly to help students differentiate between reliable peer-reviewed sources and you know, anyone's opinion that they're managing to get a bunch of hits on because it's particularly provocative. So those are just a few thoughts I'm tossing out. I don't know what the others think.
I mean, you said it more eloquently than I could. My first thought after rereading the question, after I came back, was, yeah, I think we just have to be held accountable to distinguishing and knowing what is a reliable source, what's a reliable, you know, outlet, what's a reliable and credible way of accessing information. So I think, you know, we should be accountable for finding that and, you know, trusting that. So yeah, I don't really have much else to add.
Chase has asked, he said, I'm surprised at the percentage of young voters. Do you think this is a sense of apathy?
So I'll answer what I think. So no, I don't think it's a sense of apathy. I think different universities, for example, like I was saying, Achieve Lead Vote just started in 2019. So Susquehanna University did not have a group on campus working just whose sole purpose was to get students voting until 2019. And so I think that honestly has a lot to do with it, at least in terms of Susquehanna's numbers. Many of the universities that I've come to know over the last several months through partnerships and nonprofit meetings and, higher education, consortiums of voting groups, is that these campuses need these groups to equip students and help them navigate these barriers and get them to the polls. I think our K through 12 education system in a lot of ways largely has failed us. I know I can speak for myself. I never learned about voting in school. Not until I got to college did I learn anything about how to register to vote, why it's important to vote. And yes, you can't vote until you're 18 years old, but I think the education should start long before that. The education for why it's important, how do you do that, where are polling places. I know a lot of people, even here in this session, may have had parents who encourage them to come with them to polls and encourage them to vote, but not everybody has that. So I think in a lot of ways it falls on our education system to educate people on why it's important to vote and how to vote, especially with the differences in each state. It's different how you vote in each state. I think it's easier now than ever that you can register online. So that's been a huge, for a chief lead vote to come around after registration came online, I think is like a blessing. It's made it really easy, relative to how hard it could have been trying to do registration, which I know Shari has done over the last several years by paper, hand and paper. So I don't think, in my personal opinion, I don't think it's due to apathy. I think it's, a lack of knowing how to get your, cast your vote. And I think young people are fed this narrative that their vote isn't as important. They don't know enough to have stake in the game and to cast their vote. And I think, myself included, I didn't vote until like my senior year of college. So I think a lot of young people, speaking personally, internalize that narrative and believe, well, I don't deserve a vote yet. I don't know enough yet. I don't know enough about politics. So I don't think it's due to apathy. I think it's due to kind of a combination of those different things interplaying. But I can go on forever. Somebody else add something.
Yeah, I fully agree with that, Miranda. I don't think it's a natural state of human beings not to care about whether they have health care, not to care about whether the air they breathe is clean or the water they drink is potable. I don't think, if people aren't participating in the process that makes those kinds of determinations, whether young people are going to go off and fight in a war, right? If people aren't participating in that decision-making process, it's because something is keeping them from doing that. And so it's incumbent, I suppose, on us in a small community like Susquehanna University, as Miranda said, to help students get past all of the barriers that have been erected to keep their voices suppressed. And, the trickiness of filling out these voter registration forms and figuring out where you're going to vote. And these are all barriers. And the broader discourses, like Miranda said, about, oh, you're too young to have an opinion about this. A lot of people have been made to think that if you don't have a PhD in environmental science, you're not allowed to weigh in about the quality of your water because you don't know about the chemicals that are potable and the ones that aren't. That's not our job as citizens, right? Our job as citizens is to tell our elected officials we want potable water, and then their job is to make sure we get it. So I think that's really important to keep in mind. I'm really interested in a movement across, it's, I think, growing steam, certainly among young people, to move the voting age down to 16. And the case I've heard for this is that for a lot of young Americans, they are heading off to college when they're 18. It's a new environment. It's a whole bunch of new responsibilities. It's oftentimes in another state, or it's not in their hometown. And that is like the worst moment for them to also have to figure out how to get registered to vote and where do they go vote. If they were 16, many would be in a situation they're familiar with. They'd be in their hometown. The resources would be there. And it's also the time a lot of American students are taking civics classes in high school. So it could be partnered with the civics class, how to register, how to find your voting location. I think it makes a lot of sense to actually move the voting age to 16 for those reasons. And I have, my kids have been politically active since they were 10. So there's no reason in the world why young people can't scan a newspaper online, you know, for 10 minutes in the morning. And, you know, there's plenty of people over the age of 18 who vote without ever doing that either. So I'm all for younger people voting.
If I could just add quickly, I'm going to throw a link in the chat here too, because I think that the question that Chase asked is a question we get all the time, and it's a valid question. So one of our professors here, actually, Dr. Nick Clark and Ralph Peterson, they published research on non-voters, basically dissecting the different types of non-voters and saying, you know, non-voters can't be kind of put in a monolith, but there are different kind of categories that they can fall into. Apathetic is one of the categories, and as it turns out, based on their research, that's like one of the smallest categories. So if you're interested, check out that article. I believe it links to their paper, but I'm sure you can find the paper, their research, if you're interested. But to me, that was a really great way of dissecting and thinking about that. And I also, if you didn't see it, I included, so the all in campus link, that's the link directly to Susquehanna's like homepage on the all in challenge. And there you can see our reports, our NSOLVE reports. And after going back and looking, I don't know if the person who asked that original question is still here, but they do break it down by gender, race, age. So you can look at that data with those markers too. Oh my goodness. Ralph Peterson.
And he posed a question, and I saw him in our room, so I wanted to allow him an opportunity to speak because he posed a question. Ralph, I apologize if I put you on the spot here, but would you like to talk with us?
Yes,
finishing up.
I'm here. I have coffee.
Hi.
Great discussion. Thank you for putting this together.
Could you talk very briefly to the work that you and Dr. Clark have done?
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, I think Miranda summarizes it probably better than I actually can. But essentially, we looked at the different types of non-voters and tried to explore whether or not the context of the state and the state laws and things of that nature affected the type of voter you were. And Miranda is correct. The apathetic non-voters, a fairly small percentage. What you see more of are voters that are incapable due to sometimes their own personal circumstances and sometimes to barriers in state laws. So sometimes it's health issues, it's transportation. Other times there are claims, especially that relate to states with lower integrity, of being blocked at the polling place, of requirements for ID, of sort of these type of deterrences as well.
Wonderful, thank you so much.
Also, you ask about organizations that how can the average citizen push to make voting laws easier and resist those barriers? If you're in Pennsylvania, Fair Districts PA is a really great organization, a nonpartisan organization that works to combat gerrymandering. The League of Women Voters has also been very active on this. Learning about the work of Stacey Abrams' organization, Fair Fight, and thinking about, you know, other models for that in other states. I think that is also an organization that has worked on removing barriers to voting. The ACLU is always on top of barriers to voting and was quite active in all the lawsuits about the mail-in votes in Pennsylvania this year. So those are some good resources: Fair Fight, ACLU, Fair Districts, League of Women Voters.
Yeah, no, those are excellent.
Well, we have no more questions in our chat, and I know we're running out of time. So I suppose at this point we'll wrap up and thank everyone for joining us. It's been a really wonderful session. Thank you for allowing us to share our thoughts and views and what we're doing at Susquehanna with you all. Dr. Peterson, thanks for jumping in at the end.
Appearance.
But get out there and use the vote that you've been awarded.
And
if you've any
reach out to any of us if you're, if you want to get involved or want to know anything about registering to vote. Registering to vote is not just a fall activity. We're going to have primaries coming up, school board elections coming up, all kinds of good stuff. And if you register now, you'll be all set for the next even year elections as well.